Elijah Walker was a man who understood silence. He had been taught early that the world, particularly this one America, in all its vaunted freedom would often speak in whispers before it shouted. The muted drone of the airplane cabin was, to Elijah, a familiar soundtrack. It hummed like the undercurrent of tension he had carried most of his life. He placed his leather laptop bag beneath the seat in front of him, smoothed his tailored jacket, and opened a book whose title, Scaling New Heights, felt almost symbolic. This was routine for Elijah. Another business trip, another opportunity to expand his consulting firm. He was good at what he did, and that should have been enough. But, as always, there were undercurrents. The quiet pressure of needing to be twice as good, 3 times as prepared, and eternally polite no matter the circumstances. It was the quiet burden of a black man navigating spaces that so often regarded him as other. The aisle bustled with the shuffling of passengers finding their seats, stowing luggage, and asserting small claims of territory. Elijah's focus remained on his book, though he was always aware of the movements around him. He felt her presence before he saw her. A woman, mid-50s perhaps, with sharp eyes and an air of practiced dissatisfaction. She navigated the aisle like a monarch surveying a kingdom that had, in her view, fallen into disrepair. Her suitcase caught against an armrest, and she yanked it free with a huff. Elijah glanced up briefly. His polite nod met with a flicker of disdain before she moved on. He felt it like a sudden draft, the quiet judgment, the unspoken tension. She stopped at the row where he sat, her movements freezing as though struck by an invisible barrier. Her eyes locked on him, and her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. "Excuse me," she said sharply to the passing flight attendant. "I think there's been a mistake." The flight attendant, a young woman with the kind of patience that came from years of practice, paused. "Can I help you?" "Yes," the woman replied, gesturing to Elijah without ever meeting his eyes. "I need a different seat. I can't sit here." Elijah stayed silent, his hands resting on his book. He had seen this dance before, though it still managed to tighten something in his chest. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The flight attendant checked her chart. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is your assigned seat, and the flight is fully booked." The woman's tone sharpened. "There must be something you can do. It won't work for me." Her words hung in the air, veiled enough to seem plausible, yet clear enough in their intention. Elijah turned a page in his book, his eyes scanning the lines without absorbing them. He didn't need to hear the words to understand her meaning. He had lived them. "I understand," the flight attendant said, her professionalism unwavering. "But I'll need you to take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." The woman hesitated, her irritation simmering just below the surface. Finally, she sat, her movements stiff and begrudging. Elijah felt her settle beside him, her body angled slightly away as if proximity to him might be contagious. The minutes passed slowly as the plane prepared for departure. Elijah kept his focus on the book, but the tension beside him was palpable. Her sighs came loud and pointed, each one a declaration. The words she didn't say seemed to fill the cabin more than any spoken conversation could. It wasn't just her. He felt the glances of other passengers, some sympathetic, some curious, and a few just as judgmental as hers. As the plane lifted into the air, the woman's discomfort grew louder. She shifted in her seat, adjusting her tray table with exaggerated movements that bumped against Elijah's arm. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be heard. Words like ridiculous and uncomfortable escaped her lips, each one a tiny arrow aimed his way. Elijah breathed deeply, centering himself. He had long learned that responding, even in the calmest tone, often made things worse. But the tension was rising, a quiet storm gathering strength. "You'd think," she said finally, her voice loud enough to carry to the rows behind them, "that people would have the decency to know when they're making someone else uncomfortable." The words were a gauntlet, thrown with all the arrogance of someone who believed they were unassailable. Elijah closed his book, his fingers tightening on the edges before he placed it on the tray table. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to her. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, but edged with the weight of restrained anger. The woman blinked, surprised by his directness. She recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "I'm just saying, some people don't consider how their presence might affect others." A murmur rippled from the rows nearby. Elijah let the words hang between them, giving her space to hear their absurdity. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "If you're uncomfortable," he said quietly, "that's your issue, not mine." Her face twisted, her indignation flaring like a match struck in a dark room. The unspoken storm was no longer unspoken. The battle lines were drawn, and Elijah knew all too well where this was headed. As the cabin settled into its cruising altitude, the quiet that followed was heavy with expectation. Elijah opened his book again, but the words blurred on the page. He wasn't reading anymore. The silence around him was not the absence of sound. It was the anticipation of a conflict that had yet to fully erupt. For Elijah, it was just another flight, but for everyone else, it would soon become a lesson in how prejudice hides in the everyday, waiting for the slightest excuse to rear its head. Elijah Walker knew well the art of restraint, though he had never asked to master it. The plane's ascent smoothed into the hum of cruising altitude, and he tried, as always, to focus on the moment. He returned to the lines of his book, their lessons practical, their wisdom comforting in their clarity. But the words no longer anchored him. His world had narrowed to the tension pressing against his shoulder, the heat of a stranger's silent disdain. Margaret Hill was not a loud woman, not at first. She had not shouted her disgust when she took her seat, nor openly insulted him in a way that could be named, marked, and addressed. Hers was the quieter kind of hostility, the kind that hung in the air like smoke, too insidious to be pointed at without risking accusation yourself. She adjusted her seatbelt with a sharp tug, her movements jerky and loud, each one a subtle protest against the injustice of sharing space with him. Elijah shifted slightly, leaning into the window to give her room. His gesture was met with an exaggerated sigh, her frustration escaping in heavy, pointed breaths. The discomfort grew with each passing moment, as if their shared row had become the axis upon which the entire cabin balanced. He heard it in the shifting of bodies, felt it in the weight of unspoken questions that rippled through the passengers nearby. Was he imagining it? Was it really about him? Or was she simply one of those people, perpetually dissatisfied with the world? But Elijah knew better. He had spent his life recognizing the subtle language of prejudice, the way it draped itself in plausible deniability, camouflaged as concern, as preference, as personal discomfort. It was the same language that told a black boy to lower his voice in a classroom, the same tone that scolded him for running too fast through the grocery aisles. "People might think you're up to something," his grandmother used to warn, her voice heavy with the weight of generations. Elijah had always heard the truth beneath her words. "They'll think you're a threat." Margaret turned abruptly, her elbow jabbing into his side as she reached for the flight attendant's call button. Elijah froze, his body stiffening as her arm lingered in his space, a pointed disregard for the line between them. The flight attendant arrived with a practiced smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "I'd like to switch seats," Margaret said crisply, her words clipped with impatience. "I'm feeling very uncomfortable." The attendant blinked, her professionalism masking the brief flicker of confusion. "I'm sorry to hear that. Could you clarify what's making you uncomfortable?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Elijah as though he weren't right there. Her words faltered, but her meaning didn't. I don't feel safe sitting here." The attendant's gaze shifted briefly to Elijah, then back to Margaret. Her smile tightened, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I assure you, there's no reason to feel unsafe. Mr. Walker is simply reading a book." Margaret bristled at the response, her cheeks flushing. "You don't understand. This situation, this setup, it's not ideal." Elijah's fingers curled into fists on his lap, the book forgotten. He stared straight ahead, willing himself into stillness. He had been taught not to respond, not to rise to the bait. It was a lesson born of necessity, the quiet survival strategy of a man who knew that defending himself could be misinterpreted as aggression. But the words pressed against the back of his teeth, threatening to spill. The flight attendant tilted her head slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is your assigned seat, and the flight is full. Please let me know if you need anything else." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her discontent radiating from her like heat. The flight attendant turned to leave, and Elijah exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. But the reprieve was brief. Margaret shifted in her seat again, her movements sharp and deliberate. Her elbow brushed his arm, and she jerked it away as though burned. "Some people just don't have any consideration," she muttered, loud enough for the row behind them to hear. Her tone carried the weight of accusation, the unspoken truth hanging between them. "You don't belong here." Elijah turned his head, his gaze steady and unflinching. "If you have something to say," he said quietly, his voice low but firm, "you should say it." Margaret recoiled slightly, her indignation bubbling to the surface. "I'm just saying, people should be mindful of how they make others feel." Her words landed with a sharp finality, their thin veneer of civility barely concealing their intent. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "I didn't realize sitting in my assigned seat was such an inconvenience." Margaret's face reddened, her frustration spilling over into something more dangerous. "It's not about that," she snapped. "It's about, well, people like you always acting like the rules don't apply to you." There it was. The veil lifted, the pretense abandoned. The cabin grew quieter, passengers shifting in their seats as her words hung in the air like a challenge. Elijah let out a slow breath, his hands steadying against his thighs. "People like me," he said evenly, his voice steady and measured. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed, her words faltering under the weight of the question. She glanced around, realizing for the first time that the cabin had turned against her. Passengers whispered, some shaking their heads in quiet disbelief. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Lady, he's been sitting there reading a book. You're the one making a scene." Margaret turned toward the man, her indignation spilling over. "You don't know what it's like," she snapped. "To feel unsafe, to feel what?" Elijah interrupted, his voice rising slightly but still calm. "To feel watched, judged, dismissed? I know exactly what that feels like." The cabin fell into a stunned silence, the weight of his words landing with undeniable clarity. Margaret's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing a deeper red. For a moment, she seemed ready to lash out again, but the murmurs of disapproval from the passengers around her held her in place. Elijah leaned back in his seat, his eyes turning toward the window. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth had already been spoken, and its echoes reverberated through the cabin. He had spent his life navigating moments like this, the quiet battles that were fought not with fists but with the weight of existence itself. But he knew this battle wasn't over. Not yet. The airplane cabin, though filled with passengers, had grown quiet. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the fragile stillness of tension, stretched taut and vibrating just below the surface. Elijah Walker felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Margaret Hill, seated beside him, had retreated into an exaggerated posture of discomfort, her body angled as far away from him as possible, her gaze fixed resolutely on the seat back ahead. Elijah could feel her disdain radiating, a force as palpable as the vibration of the plane's engines. It was the same quiet but thunderous rejection he had felt in boardrooms, on sidewalks, even at neighborhood barbecues. The feeling was one of being tolerated but never accepted, seen but never acknowledged. Margaret's discomfort wasn't simply personal. It was structural, embedded in the unspoken hierarchies that defined their shared world. The flight attendant passed by again, her gaze flickering toward Elijah and Margaret. He caught her glance, and for a moment, there was something unspoken in it, an apology, perhaps, or recognition. But it vanished quickly, replaced by her professional mask. She offered both passengers a tight smile, but Margaret refused to meet her eyes. Margaret shifted again, her movements deliberate and theatrical. She adjusted her scarf, folded and refolded her tray table, her elbow brushing Elijah's space with each exaggerated motion. He held his composure, his hands resting on the cover of the book he had long since stopped reading. The quiet battle continued her gestures, his stillness until the tension finally broke. "You'd think," Margaret said loudly, as though addressing the air itself, "that people would understand basic decency." Elijah turned his head, his gaze steady but sharp. "And what does decency look like to you?" he asked, his voice calm. Margaret blinked, her mouth tightening. "It's about respect," she replied, though the words sounded hollow as she said it. "Some people just don't know how to respect others." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and undeniable. Margaret's tone was a weapon, sharpened by a lifetime of unexamined privilege. Elijah recognized it instantly, the vague accusations, the careful avoidance of specifics that allowed her to wield offense without consequence. "Respect?" Elijah repeated, leaning back slightly in his seat. His tone was measured, his words deliberate. "Respect is sitting in your assigned seat without assuming the person next to you is the problem." Margaret's face flushed crimson, but she recovered quickly. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she said, her voice rising. "I have every right to speak up if I feel unsafe." "Unsafe?" Elijah asked, his voice dropping to a lower register, calm but firm. "What about me makes you feel unsafe?" Margaret's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked away, her discomfort now mingling with embarrassment. The passengers nearby were no longer pretending not to listen. A woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, her face marked with disapproval. A younger man 2 rows back had pulled out his phone, its camera aimed discreetly at the confrontation. Margaret turned to the flight attendant again, raising her hand in a sharp, commanding gesture. "I want to speak to someone in charge," she demanded. "This is unacceptable." The flight attendant approached, her smile strained but professional. "Ma'am, I've already explained that the flight is fully booked. There are no other seats available." Margaret's voice grew louder, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the cabin. "I shouldn't have to sit here and feel threatened. This man is what?" Elijah interrupted, his voice still calm but edged with steel. "Sitting here, reading a book? What exactly have I done that's made you feel so threatened?" Margaret floundered, her indignation faltering under the weight of the question. She glanced around, looking for support, but found only averted gazes and shaking heads. The flight attendant's expression hardened slightly, her patience thinning. "Ma'am," she said, her tone firmer now, "please remain seated and refrain from disrupting the flight." Margaret's face twisted into an expression of defiance. "Oh, so now I'm the one causing the problem?" she snapped. "This is exactly what's wrong with this country. You let people like him do whatever they want, and the rest of us have to suffer for it." The words landed like a slap, drawing audible gasps from the passengers nearby. Elijah felt the sting of them, sharp and familiar, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "People like me?" he asked. "You mean people who paid for their seat and expected to be treated with dignity?" Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. The younger man with the phone spoke up, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Lady, you're the only one making this flight miserable. Maybe take a look in the mirror." Margaret whipped her head around, glaring at the man. "You don't know what it's like," she snapped, "to feel unsafe, to feel like someone could hurt you at any moment." Elijah exhaled slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had spent his life navigating spaces where his very presence was perceived as a threat. And here was Margaret, weaponizing her discomfort, turning it into an accusation, a justification for her behavior. "Unsafe," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet fury. "Do you know what it's like to feel unsafe every day? To wonder if your existence will be enough for someone to call the police? Or worse?" You don't feel unsafe, you feel uncomfortable. And that's not my problem. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder, rippling through the cabin like a tide turning against Margaret. A woman a few rows ahead turned in her seat, her voice cutting through the tension. Why don't you just stop before you embarrass yourself even more? Margaret's face reddened further, her indignation boiling over. You people are all the same, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Always making everything about race. Elijah leaned back, his hands resting on the armrests. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his words cutting through the air like a blade. I didn't bring race into this. You did. Now ask yourself why. The cabin fell silent once more, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Margaret looked around, her defiance flickering under the collective disapproval of the passengers. She crossed her arms and turned away, muttering under her breath. Elijah turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. The battle wasn't over, it never was, but in this moment, he had claimed a small victory. It was a quiet triumph, the kind that didn't change the world but reminded him that he could still hold his ground, even in the face of quiet contempt. Elijah Walker had long known that there were limits to silence. Even the calmest waters, when provoked by a relentless storm, would break into waves. The tension in the cabin of Flight 243, already thick, was about to burst its fragile bounds. Margaret Hill, stiff and fuming beside him, sat in her seat like a powder keg, her indignation simmering just beneath the surface. Her murmurs, once muttered to herself, now grew louder, directed toward no one and yet meant for everyone. This is exactly what's wrong with the world today, she said loudly enough to carry. No one has any standards anymore. Decency? Gone. Respect? Forget it. Elijah turned his head slightly, his profile calm against the storm she was brewing. He said nothing. The lesson of silence, drilled into him since childhood, was to let people's words condemn them. But the murmurs around him, the whispered outrage of passengers who had been quiet too long, hinted that this silence might not hold. Margaret reached for the call button again, her motion sharp and exaggerated. The flight attendant appeared with a patience that seemed infinite. Yes, ma'am? Margaret gestured broadly toward Elijah without looking at him. I've had enough of this, she said, her voice tight with anger. I demand to be moved. This man is invading my space and making me uncomfortable. The attendant's professional mask slipped for a moment, a flash of incredulity crossing her face. She glanced at Elijah, who sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his book unopened. Ma'am, the attendant said carefully, I've explained that the flight is fully booked. I assure you, Mr. Walker has done nothing wrong. Margaret's voice rose, each word sharper than the last. Nothing wrong? I've been harassed since the moment I sat down. I don't feel safe, and I will not be silenced. A murmur rippled through the rows around them. Passengers shifted in their seats, their whispers growing louder. A man across the aisle leaned into the conversation, his expression incredulous. Lady, he said, his voice firm, you're the only one harassing anyone here. Margaret whipped her head toward him, her face flushing with anger. Stay out of this, she snapped. You don't know what it's like to feel unsafe. Elijah finally turned, his calm gaze meeting hers. Unsafe? He asked quietly, his voice measured but cutting. Unsafe how exactly? Margaret faltered, her mouth opening and closing. You don't understand. I've been polite, but you're making this impossible. Polite? Elijah's tone sharpened, though his voice remained steady. From the moment you sat down, you've made it clear that my presence offends you. Not because of anything I've done, but because of who I am. Margaret's face twisted with indignation. How dare you twist my words? She shouted, her voice carrying through the cabin. This isn't about race. Don't make it about race. The passengers around them gasped audibly. A young woman 2 rows ahead turned in her seat, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. Then what is it about, ma'am? Because all we've seen is you acting like a child. Margaret stood abruptly, her movements jarring enough to knock over her cup of water. The plastic clattered against the tray table, and the spill spread across the armrest. She didn't notice or didn't care. Her body shook with rage as she pointed a trembling finger at Elijah. "You people always do this," she yelled. "Always turning it around, making yourselves the victim. It's disgusting." Elijah exhaled slowly, his patience straining under the weight of her words. He stayed seated, his composure intact, but his voice cut through the cabin with quiet force. "You're right," he said. "I'm tired of being the victim. So why don't you stop trying to make me one?" The passengers erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others openly shaking their heads at Margaret's behavior. One man raised his phone, capturing the confrontation as it unfolded. The red light of the recording was unmistakable. Margaret noticed. Her fury turned toward the man with the camera. "You can't record me," she screamed. "Turn that off right now." The man leaned back in his seat, unfazed. "It's a public flight," he said coolly. "You want to make a scene? Fine. But now everyone will see it." Margaret lunged toward him, her arm outstretched. But before she could reach him, the flight attendant stepped forward, her voice now commanding. "Ma'am, sit down immediately. This behavior is unacceptable." Margaret froze, her chest heaving with fury. She turned back toward Elijah, her face contorted with rage. "This is all your fault," she hissed. "People like you ruin everything. You don't belong here." The cabin fell into a stunned silence, the air heavy with disbelief. Elijah's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the armrests. Slowly he stood, his full height towering over her. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of decades of experience. "I belong here," he said. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else. And I won't let you or anyone else tell me otherwise." The passengers erupted into applause, their collective frustration finally finding release. Margaret's face turned crimson, her defiance flickering under the weight of their disapproval. But she didn't sit. Instead, she turned to the flight attendant, her voice trembling with indignation. "You see," she said, gesturing wildly, "this is harassment. I won't stand for it." The flight attendant signaled to another crew member. Within moments, a male attendant approached, his expression firm. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to calm down. If you don't, we'll have to report this to the authorities upon landing." Margaret bristled, her body rigid with anger. "Report me? For what?" "Defending myself. For disrupting the flight and threatening another passenger," the man replied evenly. Margaret's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for allies, but finding none. The passengers stared back at her, their expressions ranging from disbelief to open disdain. She slumped into her seat, her muttering barely audible above the hum of the engines. Elijah remained standing for a moment longer, his breath steadying. He nodded once to the flight attendant, then sat back down, his gaze fixed out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly below them, serene and unbothered. But Elijah wasn't unbothered. The sting of Margaret's words lingered, their barbs sinking deep into places he rarely let himself feel. He knew this wasn't the end, not of the flight, not of the confrontation, and certainly not of the larger struggle. This was merely a moment, one of many in a lifetime of quiet battles. As the plane hummed steadily toward its destination, the tension in row 17 remained. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He had weathered the storm, but he knew there was more to come. There always was. Elijah Walker stared out of the airplane window, the clouds below a serene expanse of white, indifferent to the chaos brewing within the cabin. His reflection stared back at him, stoic but weary. The applause from earlier had died down, but the tension in row 17 clung to the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Margaret Hill sat beside him, her body rigid with indignation, her muttering sharp as glass shards against the hum of the plane's engines. "This is outrageous," she hissed to no one in particular. "Forced to sit here, treated like a criminal for speaking the truth. This is what the world has come to." Elijah's hands rested on his lap, fingers gently tapping against one another in a quiet rhythm. He had no intention of responding. Margaret's words, though venomous, were aimed at the air, a desperate grasp for validation in a cabin that had turned against her. But the battle was far from over. The subtle war of wills between them, between who belonged and who didn't, was not one easily conceded. Elijah knew this. He had always known it. The flight attendant reappeared, her composure fraying but her professionalism intact. She crouched slightly, speaking softly to Elijah. "Sir, we've notified ground security. They'll handle this when we land. Please let us know if there's anything we can do in the meantime." Elijah gave her a brief nod. "Thank you." Margaret's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Oh, so now he's getting special treatment?" She leaned forward, her tone dripping with disdain. Typical. Always playing the victim. The attendant turned to her, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I've warned you repeatedly. If this behavior continues, I'll have no choice but to report your conduct to the captain." "Report me for what?" Margaret spat. "For standing up for myself? For refusing to be intimidated?" The attendant didn't respond, simply straightened and walked away. Margaret turned back toward Elijah, her movements exaggerated as if her very proximity to him were a burden she had to bear. "You people," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough to carry, "always think the world owes you something." Elijah stiffened. He had heard that phrase countless times. The careful weaponization of "you people" wielded with a smile in corporate boardrooms or whispered in line at the grocery store. It was always meant to cut, to remind him of his place, to draw a line between himself and those who believed they stood above him. He turned his head slowly, his voice low but firm. "And what exactly do you think the world owes you?" Margaret recoiled slightly, but the venom in her expression only deepened. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she snapped. "It's just common sense. People like you make everything about race." Elijah raised an eyebrow, the weight of his restraint pressing against his ribs. "I haven't said a word about race," he replied. "That was all you." The murmurs of the passengers began to rise again, their whispers no longer discreet. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Lady, why don't you just stop? Everyone here is sick of hearing you." Margaret turned on him, her face flushed with fury. "You don't know what it's like," she snapped, "to feel unsafe, to feel like you're the only one willing to speak the truth." "Unsafe?" A woman 2 rows ahead said, her voice cutting. "From what? A man reading a book? Give me a break." Margaret ignored her, her focus narrowing back to Elijah. She pointed a trembling finger at him, her voice shaking with emotion. "You're the problem. People like you. Always stirring up trouble. Always demanding things you don't deserve." Elijah exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. "People like me," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with a rising edge, "have spent their lives trying to navigate a world that refuses to see us as human. People like me are tired of being told we don't belong in spaces we've earned. And people like you," he paused, his words hanging in the air like a blade. "People like you cling to your fear and your hate because it's the only thing that makes you feel powerful." The cabin fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her indignation seemed to falter under the gaze of the passengers around her, their disapproval clear and united. Margaret's rage, however, was not extinguished. Instead, it turned erratic, unpredictable. She stood abruptly, her movements jerky and chaotic. "This is harassment," she shouted. "This is an attack on me, and I won't stand for it." The flight attendant hurried back, accompanied by a male crew member. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down immediately," she said firmly. Margaret ignored her, gesturing wildly toward Elijah. "He's the one causing all this. He's been provoking me from the moment I sat down." Elijah remained seated, his composure unbroken. "I've done nothing but sit here," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "You've been attacking me since you walked onto this plane." The male crew member stepped closer, his voice authoritative. "Ma'am, if you don't sit down, We'll be forced to restrain you. Margaret whirled around, her voice rising to a fever pitch. You can't do this. You're all against me because I'm the only one brave enough to tell the truth. The passengers erupted in murmurs again, their frustration boiling over. A man shouted from the back, "Get her off this plane already." Margaret's defiance turned desperate. She lunged toward Elijah, her hands clawing at the air as if trying to pull him into her chaos. Elijah leaned back, his arms raised defensively, but before she could reach him, two passengers jumped up, restraining her. "That's enough," one of them said, his voice sharp. "You're out of control." The male crew member stepped in, producing a set of zip ties. "Ma'am, this is your final warning." Margaret thrashed against their grip, her voice breaking into a shriek. "You can't do this to me. I'm the victim here." The crew secured her wrists, guiding her back into her seat as she continued to scream. Elijah exhaled slowly, his body tense but steady. He caught the eyes of a passenger across the aisle, a silent exchange of understanding, of shared disbelief at the scene unfolding around them. As the cabin settled into a strained quiet, Elijah turned back toward the window. The clouds outside stretched endlessly, indifferent to the turmoil within. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. The battle wasn't over, not in the cabin, not in the world beyond. But for now he had stood his ground, and that was enough. For now. The silence that fell over the cabin was not the calm after a storm. It was the brittle stillness that comes when a storm pauses, momentarily withheld but still brimming with energy. Elijah Walker sat quietly in his seat, his breathing steady but his muscles tense. His arm still bore faint scratches where Margaret Hill had lunged at him in her frenzy. The zip ties on her wrists, though secured, seemed to do little to contain her fury. She muttered under her breath, her words venomous and slurred with indignation. "You'll all see," she hissed, her voice barely audible but sharp enough to pierce the quiet. "This isn't over. People like him always think they can get away with it." Elijah turned his gaze out the window. He tried to focus on the expanse of sky, the endless horizon that should have felt freeing. But inside he felt anything but free. The weight of the confrontation pressed against his chest. It wasn't the scratches or even the words. It was the weariness that came with knowing this moment wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a pattern, one he had encountered his entire life. The murmurs among the passengers began to grow again, a low tide of whispers and shared disbelief. Some expressed sympathy for Elijah, their glances fleeting but kind. Others spoke in harsher tones, their frustration directed at Margaret. "This is why we can't have nice things," one man muttered, loud enough to be heard. A younger woman across the aisle, her phone still discreetly recording, leaned toward Elijah. "You okay?" she asked softly. Elijah nodded but didn't speak. He wasn't sure he could trust his voice not to betray the exhaustion he felt. It wasn't just the exhaustion of this moment, but the accumulation of countless others like it, the endless microaggressions, the sidelong glances, the quiet assumptions that demanded he justify his very existence. Margaret, emboldened by her own delusions, suddenly turned toward the flight attendant. "You're all complicit," she spat. "I'm the one being harassed here, and you're doing nothing." The flight attendant, who had maintained a stoic professionalism throughout, now showed the faintest crack in her demeanor. Her voice, though still controlled, carried an edge. "Ma'am, you've disrupted this flight enough. Any further outbursts will be reported to the captain." Margaret's face twisted, her cheeks flushed with fury. "Report me? For what?" "For defending myself against a threat." The passengers collectively stiffened at the word. Threat. It hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Elijah turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Margaret. For the first time, his composure showed a fracture, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "A threat," he repeated, the words deliberate. "I've done nothing but sit here, read a book, and endure your abuse. And you call me a threat?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Your kind always twist things," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Always playing the victim, always making everything about race." Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice now sharp and unyielding. And your kind always make sure it is about race, don't you? You don't even see me as a person. I'm just something to fear, something to blame. The cabin grew deathly quiet. The other passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Their eyes flicked between Elijah and Margaret, their faces etched with a mix of shock and discomfort. The young woman with the phone lowered it slightly, her gaze shifting from the screen to Elijah himself, her expression pained. Margaret scoffed, her indignation unshaken. I'm not afraid of you, she said, though her tone betrayed her. I just don't want to be forced to sit next to someone who… Someone who what? Elijah interrupted, his voice rising now, breaking through the polite boundaries he had tried to maintain. Someone who doesn't look like you? Someone you've decided doesn't belong here. Margaret faltered for the first time, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Elijah didn't let her recover. You think this is about you, he continued, his voice steady but powerful, carrying the weight of decades of restraint. Your comfort, your assumptions. But it's not. This is about the fact that people like me have to fight for the right to exist in spaces like this, just because people like you can't see past your own fear. The murmurs of agreement from the passengers grew louder. The man across the aisle leaned forward again, his voice clear and firm. He's right, lady. You're the only one making this flight miserable. Margaret, cornered and humiliated, lashed out in desperation. You're all against me, she shouted, her voice shrill. This is harassment. I'll sue every one of you for this. The flight attendant returned, now accompanied by another crew member. Her tone was no longer polite. Ma'am, this behavior is unacceptable. You've been restrained for the safety of the passengers, and authorities will meet you upon landing. Margaret thrashed against the zip ties, her face red with fury. This is illegal. You can't treat me like this. I'm the victim here. Elijah leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. His anger hadn't dissipated, but it had cooled into something heavier, a deep, familiar ache. He turned back to the window, letting Margaret's words wash over him like static. They no longer mattered. The plane began its descent, the announcement from the cockpit cutting through the tension. The passengers started to prepare for landing, their movements subdued, their faces marked with the weight of what they had witnessed. Margaret, still bound, continued to mutter under her breath, her defiance unbroken even as the ground drew closer. Elijah closed his eyes, his hands resting on his knees. The confrontation was over, but the battle both on the plane and in the larger world was far from finished. He thought of the lives of those who had come before him, who had fought harder battles and paid heavier prices for moments like this. His existence, his defiance, was part of that legacy. As the plane touched down with a jolt, Elijah felt a strange mix of relief and resolve. Margaret's words, her actions, her very presence, were reminders of the work still to be done. But they were also reminders of his strength, of the quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of hatred could strip away. And that, he realized, was its own kind of victory. The plane touched down with a lurch, jolting Elijah Walker slightly forward in his seat. The familiar thud of wheels meeting asphalt should have signaled relief, the end of the journey. But the tension in the cabin told a different story. For Elijah, the descent was a metaphor, a return to a ground that was no less fraught with turbulence than the skies above. Margaret Hill sat beside him, still bound at the wrists, her muttering an incessant hum of indignation. You'll all regret this, she hissed, her voice low but venomous. Mark my words. You're the ones in the wrong. The plane slowed, the engines whining as it taxied to the gate. Elijah looked out of the window, the tarmac lined with the usual procession of ground crew and vehicles. But near the gate, a pair of uniformed officers waited, their presence a reminder that this ordeal was not yet over. The passengers remained seated, their movements restrained by an unspoken agreement to wait for the inevitable confrontation. The usual jostling and rush to retrieve bags from overhead compartments were absent. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that sits heavily on the chest. As the plane came to a halt and the seatbelt sign blinked off, The flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated while we address an issue with law enforcement. Thank you for your cooperation." Margaret bristled at the announcement. "Law enforcement?" she said, her voice rising in outrage. "What are they going to do? Arrest me for defending myself?" The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers exchanging looks of disbelief. A man in the back muttered, "They should have thrown her off mid-flight." The quiet ripple of laughter that followed was a rare moment of levity, but it quickly dissolved under the weight of what was about to unfold. The officers boarded the plane, their presence commanding. They moved swiftly down the aisle, their expressions professional but firm. Margaret, seeing them approach, straightened in her seat, her defiance sharpening into something more desperate. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I haven't done anything wrong." The lead officer stopped at row 17, his gaze flicking to Elijah briefly before settling on Margaret. "Ma'am, we've been informed of your behavior on this flight. We need you to come with us." Margaret's voice pitched higher, teetering on the edge of hysteria. "I'm not going anywhere. This is a setup. That man," she pointed at Elijah, her finger trembling with rage, "he provoked me. He's the real problem." The officer didn't flinch. "Ma'am, we've received multiple accounts from passengers and crew. Your actions endangered the safety of this flight. Please cooperate, or we'll have to escort you forcibly." Margaret twisted in her seat, her gaze darting around the cabin as if searching for someone to support her. But the passengers stared back, their faces a wall of quiet condemnation. Even those who had been silent throughout the flight now seemed united in their disdain. "You're all against me," she said, her voice trembling. "This is harassment. This is discrimination." Elijah remained seated, his expression unreadable. He wanted to feel relief, vindication even, but all he felt was a deep exhaustion. This moment, like so many others in his life, was not a victory. It was a reminder of how deeply prejudice was woven into the fabric of the world. Margaret's cries of victimhood, her refusal to see her own culpability, were not unique, they were echoes of a larger sickness. The officers moved closer, one of them reaching for Margaret's arm. She recoiled, her movements jerky and panicked. "Don't touch me," she shrieked. "I'll sue all of you. I'll have your badges for this." The younger officer, his voice calm but firm, said, "Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Margaret's resistance faltered, her body stiffening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She allowed the officers to help her stand, though her muttering continued. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low but audible. "I'll see every one of you in court." As Margaret was escorted down the aisle, the passengers watched in silence. Some shook their heads, others exchanged knowing glances. A few had their phones raised, capturing the moment for posterity or perhaps for justice. When she passed Elijah, she stopped briefly, her gaze locking onto him. Her expression was a twisted mix of anger and something else, fear, perhaps, or the faintest hint of regret. "You think you've won," she said, her voice trembling. "But people like you'll always be the problem." Elijah met her gaze, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet strength. "The only problem here is you." Margaret's face reddened, but she said nothing more. The officers urged her forward, guiding her toward the exit. As the door closed behind them, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. A woman nearby turned to Elijah, her voice soft but earnest. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Elijah nodded, offering a faint smile. "Thank you." The passengers began to gather their belongings, the tension easing as the ordeal came to an end. But for Elijah, the weight of the experience lingered. He retrieved his laptop bag and stood, his movements deliberate and composed. As he made his way down the aisle, he felt the eyes of the passengers on him, not with judgment, but with something closer to respect. When he stepped off the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge greeted him. He paused for a moment, his breath steadying as he prepared to step back into the world. The confrontation was over, but the echoes of it would remain. Margaret's words, her actions, her refusal to see him as fully human. They were not hers alone. They belonged to a society still unwilling to confront its own reflection. Elijah walked toward the terminal, his steps firm and deliberate. He carried with him the burden of the flight, but also the quiet resolve to keep moving forward. In a world that so often demanded he justify his existence, simply standing tall was an act of defiance. And in that moment it was enough. For now. Elijah Walker stepped into the terminal, the sterile lights above casting a cold glow over the bustling crowd. The air was filled with the usual sounds of an airport. Hurried footsteps, muffled announcements, and the distant hum of conveyor belts. Yet, for Elijah, the world felt strangely muted, as though the confrontation on the plane had left an invisible barrier between him and everything else. He carried his bag lightly, but the weight of what had transpired pressed heavily on his shoulders. Around him, passengers from the flight moved with a shared sense of relief, their glances occasionally finding him. Some offered small, apologetic nods. Others avoided his gaze altogether, their discomfort palpable. Elijah had seen this before. The aftermath of such moments often brought more silence than action. People were quick to disapprove of the explicit ugliness they had witnessed, but that disapproval rarely translated into meaningful change. The real work, the hard work, was in confronting the implicit biases that allowed such moments to exist in the first place. Near the gate's exit, he noticed Margaret Hill. She was surrounded by 2 uniformed officers and a flight attendant, her voice raised in defiance. "I've done nothing wrong," she exclaimed, her face red with anger. "This is all a misunderstanding. That man provoked me." The officers remained stoic, their professionalism unshaken. The flight attendant, however, looked exhausted, her earlier patience now replaced with quiet exasperation. Margaret's voice carried across the terminal, drawing stares from travelers who slowed their steps to watch the spectacle. Elijah considered walking past without another glance, but something held him in place. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity, exhaustion, or the need to ensure that this moment, at least, had some semblance of accountability. He lingered near a window, his reflection merging with the plains outside. Margaret turned suddenly, catching sight of him. Her expression shifted, her defiance hardening into something sharper. "You!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "This is your fault." Elijah didn't flinch. He met her gaze, his calm expression unyielding. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The truth of her actions and the weight of the consequences was hers alone to bear. As Margaret was escorted away, her protests fading into the distance, Elijah turned back toward the concourse. He passed a newsstand where television screens displayed the latest headlines. One screen caught his attention. Footage of the incident from the flight, already circulating online. The caption read, "Passenger removed after mid-flight altercation goes viral." Elijah sighed. The world was watching now, but what would they see? Would they see the larger story, the story of how prejudice weaves itself into the fabric of everyday life, creating moments like this? Or would they reduce it to entertainment, another viral video to be consumed and forgotten? He stepped into a cafe, the smell of coffee and baked goods momentarily grounding him. As he waited for his order, a man approached hesitantly. He was middle-aged, dressed in a business suit, and his expression was one of awkward earnestness. "I just wanted to say," the man began, his voice low, "what happened on that plane, it was wrong. You handled it better than I would have." Elijah studied him for a moment, searching for sincerity. "Thank you," he said simply. The man shifted uncomfortably, as though unsure whether to say more. Finally, he added, "I guess it's just shocking, you know, that people still act like that." Elijah gave him a small, tight smile. "It's only shocking if you haven't been paying attention." The man opened his mouth to reply but seemed to think better of it. With a nod, he stepped away, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts once more. By the time Elijah reached the baggage claim, the adrenaline from the flight had faded, leaving him with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. He retrieved his suitcase and began making his way toward the exit, the cool night air outside a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the day. As he waited for a car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find a flood of notifications, text messages from friends, missed calls, and links to articles about the incident. One message stood out. It was from his sister, Naomi. Saw the video. You okay? Call me when you can. He hesitated, then typed a quick response. I'm fine, just tired. We'll call soon. But he wasn't fine, not entirely. The exhaustion he felt wasn't just physical. It was the weight of a lifetime of moments like this, moments that demanded he defend his humanity against those who refused to see it. The car arrived, and Elijah slid into the back seat. As the city blurred past the window, he allowed himself to reflect on the day. Margaret Hill was not an anomaly. She was a symptom. Her words, her actions, her refusal to take responsibility, they were all reflections of a larger truth about the society they shared. Racism wasn't always loud. It wasn't always someone shouting slurs or committing overt acts of violence. Often, it was quieter, insidious. It was in the way Margaret had claimed discomfort as a weapon, framing herself as the victim while erasing Elijah's existence. It was in the way passengers had hesitated to intervene until her behavior became undeniable. It was in the awkward apologies and half-hearted acknowledgments after the fact. For Elijah, the challenge was not just in enduring these moments but in continuing to hope that the cumulative weight of such incidents might one day tip the scale toward justice. As the car approached his destination, Elijah closed his eyes briefly, the hum of the engine a soothing background. He thought of his father, who had once told him, "You can't carry the weight of the world, son, but you can carry yourself with dignity. And sometimes that's enough." Elijah stepped out of the car and into the night, the air crisp against his skin. He squared his shoulders, his steps steady as he walked toward the lighted doorway ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations with the quiet and not-so-quiet injustices of the world. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of rest, a moment to let go of the storm he had weathered. For now, that was enough.